after reporting my married co-worker's unwanted advances to HR. She lost her job and lead to her husband until he called me for the real truthy everyone. I'm Alex, and I need to share with you one of the most uncomfortable and bizarre workplace situations I've ever experienced. This story involves workplace harassment, lies, manipulation, and a phone call that completely changed everything. By the end of this, you'll understand why I say that sometimes the truth has a way of coming out in the most unexpected ways, and why it's so important to stand up for yourself even when it feels like you're the one being painted as the villain. Let me start by giving you some context about my work situation. I'm a software developer at a mid-sized tech company in Portland, Oregon. I've been there for about 3 years, and overall, it's been a pretty good place to work. The company has around 100 employees, so it's big enough to have proper HR policies, but small enough that most people know each other at least by sight. I'm 28 years old, single, and generally keep to myself at work. I'm friendly with my colleagues, but I've always believed in maintaining professional boundaries, especially when it comes to office relationships. About a year ago, our team got a new project manager named Rachel. Rachel was 35, married with 2 young kids, and seemed competent at her job from day one. She had this confident, outgoing personality that made her popular pretty quickly around the office. Rachel was attractive, well-dressed, and had this way of making everyone feel like they were her best friend. Initially, I thought she was just naturally charismatic and good at building rapport with the team. For the first few months, our interactions were completely professional. Rachel would assign tasks, check in on project progress, and participate in team meetings just like any other manager. She was friendly, but not inappropriately so, and I had no reason to think anything was unusual about her behavior toward me or anyone else. The first sign that something was off happened during a company happy hour about 6 months ago. These events were pretty casual. The company would rent out a local bar after work hours, and employees could come and go as they pleased. I usually showed up for an hour or so just to be social, then headed home. During this particular happy hour, Rachel approached me at the bar while I was waiting to order a drink. She started by making small talk about work projects, but then the conversation took a weird turn. She began asking personal questions about my dating life, whether I lived alone, and what I did for fun on weekends. At the time, I figured she was just trying to be friendly and get to know her team members better. When she offered to buy my drink, I politely declined and said I preferred to pay for my own. She laughed and said something like, "Always so independent. Alex, I like that about you." Looking back, that should have been my first red flag, but honestly, I was just trying to be polite and maintain a good working relationship with my manager. I finished my drink, made some excuse about meeting friends, and left early. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing that Rachel was finding reasons to have one-on-one meetings with me more frequently than seemed necessary. She'd call me into her office to discuss projects that could have been handled over email, or she'd suggest we grab coffee to brainstorm ideas for upcoming deadlines. During these meetings, she'd often make comments about my appearance, saying things like, "That shirt really brings out your eyes," or "You must work out, you're looking really good lately." These comments made me uncomfortable, but I wasn't sure if I was overreacting. Rachel was married, after all, and I thought maybe she was just being friendly in a way that I was misinterpreting. I started trying to deflect her compliments and keep our conversations focused strictly on work matters. The situation escalated about 4 months ago when Rachel started texting me outside of work hours. At first, the messages seemed work-related. She'd send me articles about industry trends or ask questions about project timelines. But gradually, the texts became more personal. She'd ask what I was doing on evenings and weekends, share details about her personal life, and make jokes about how boring her husband was compared to interesting guys like me. I tried to maintain professional boundaries by keeping my responses brief and work-focused, but Rachel seemed to interpret my politeness as encouragement. The texts became more frequent and increasingly inappropriate. She started sending me photos of herself at the gym, at restaurants, or just random selfies with messages like "thought you might enjoy this" or "wish you were here with me." One particularly uncomfortable incident happened when Rachel texted me late one evening while she was apparently out for drinks with friends. The message said, "My husband is home with the kids again while I'm out having fun. Sometimes I wonder what it would be like to be with someone who actually appreciates adventure. Someone like you." I didn't respond to that message, hoping she'd get the hint that I wasn't interested in whatever she was implying, but Rachel didn't get the hint. Instead, she seemed to take my lack of response as playing hard to get. She started being more direct in her advances, both through text messages and in person at work. She'd find excuses to touch my arm or shoulder during conversations, stand unnecessarily close to me during meetings, and make suggestive comments that couldn't be misinterpreted as anything other than flirtation. The breaking point came about 3 months ago during a business trip to Seattle for an industry conference. Our company had sent several employees, and we were all staying at the same hotel. On the second night of the conference, there was a networking event that ran late. Most of our colleagues had returned to their rooms by around 10 p.m., but Rachel suggested we grab a nightcap at the hotel bar to debrief about the day. Against my better judgment, I agreed, thinking it would be a quick professional conversation. We found a quiet corner table, and Rachel ordered wine while I stuck with a beer. For the first few minutes, we actually did talk about the conference sessions and potential business opportunities. But then Rachel started talking about how nice it was to get away from her mundane home life, and how she felt like she could be herself around me in a way she couldn't with other people. Then she reached across the table and put her hand on mine, saying, "Alex, I think you know how I feel about you. I've been trying to be subtle, but maybe subtlety isn't working." She went on to say that she found me attractive, that she thought we had chemistry, and that she was interested in exploring what could happen between us. Despite being married, I was completely shocked and uncomfortable. I pulled my hand away and told her directly that I wasn't interested in any kind of romantic or physical relationship with her, that she was married, and that we worked together. I tried to be respectful but firm, explaining that I valued our professional relationship, but that anything beyond that was completely off the table. Rachel's response was not what I expected. Instead of backing off or apologizing, she seemed almost amused by my rejection. She said something like, "Come on, Alex, don't be so uptight. I'm not talking about running away together. I'm just talking about having some fun. What happens on business trips stays on business trips, right?" I told her again that I wasn't interested, paid for my drink, and went back to my room. I hoped that my clear rejection would finally end her inappropriate behavior, but I was wrong. When we returned to the office after the conference, Rachel's behavior actually got worse. She seemed to interpret my rejection as a challenge rather than a clear boundary. She started being more aggressive in her approaches, cornering me in empty conference rooms, sending more explicit text messages, and even making comments in front of other colleagues that had sexual undertones. One particularly egregious incident happened when Rachel scheduled a fake meeting with me, claiming we needed to discuss budget allocations for an upcoming project. When I arrived at the conference room, she had dimmed the lights and was wearing a low-cut top that was definitely not her usual professional attire. She told me she had been thinking about our conversation in Seattle and wanted to give me another chance to reconsider when I again declined and tried to leave. She actually blocked the door and said, "Alex, I know you're attracted to me. I can see it in the way you look at me. Stop playing games." I had to physically move around her to get out of the room, and I was genuinely concerned about how this situation was spiraling out of control. That night, I went home and seriously considered what my options were. Rachel was my direct supervisor, which complicated things significantly. I was worried about potential retaliation if I reported her behavior, but I was also increasingly concerned about what might happen if I didn't. Her behavior was clearly escalating, and I was running out of ways to deflect her advances while maintaining any semblance of a professional Relationship. The final straw came 2 weeks later when Rachel cornered me in the office parking garage after work. She had apparently been waiting by my car and approached me as I was trying to leave. She said she was tired of my games and that she knew I wanted her as much as she wanted me. When I again firmly declined and tried to get in my car, she pressed herself against me and tried to kiss me. I had to physically push her away, and I told her in no uncertain terms that her behavior was completely inappropriate and needed to stop immediately. Rachel's response was anger and threats. She said that as my manager, she could make my work life very difficult if I continued to reject her. She implied that she could give me negative performance reviews, exclude me from important projects, or even find reasons to fire me if I didn't start being more cooperative. That threat was the moment I realized I had no choice but to report her behavior to HR. I went home that evening and documented every inappropriate incident I could remember, including dates, times, locations, and witnesses when available. I saved all of her inappropriate text messages and emails as evidence. The next morning, I requested a meeting with our HR director, Janet, and laid out the entire situation. Janet was professional and took my complaint seriously. She explained the company's harassment policy and assured me that they would investigate the matter thoroughly. She also warned me that Rachel would need to be informed about the complaint and would have the opportunity to respond to the allegations. The investigation took about 2 weeks. During that time, I had minimal contact with Rachel, which was actually a relief. Janet interviewed several of my colleagues who had witnessed some of Rachel's inappropriate comments and behavior. She also reviewed the text messages and emails I had provided as evidence. About 3 weeks after I filed my complaint, Janet called me into her office to inform me of the investigation results. She said that based on the evidence and witness testimonies, the company had concluded that Rachel had indeed engaged in sexual harassment and abuse of her managerial position. The company decided to terminate Rachel's employment immediately. Janet assured me that the company took these matters seriously and that there would be no retaliation against me for reporting the harassment. She also mentioned that they would be reviewing their policies and providing additional training to prevent similar situations in the future. I was relieved that the company had taken appropriate action, but I was also nervous about potential backlash. Workplace harassment cases can be messy, and I knew that not everyone would necessarily see the situation from my perspective. My concerns proved to be justified, but not in the way I expected. About a week after Rachel's termination, I received a phone call that completely blindsided me. The caller identified himself as Mark, Rachel's husband, and he said he needed to talk to me about what had really happened at our company. Mark explained that Rachel had told him a completely different version of events. According to her story, I had been the one pursuing her inappropriately. She claimed that I had been sending her unwanted messages, making inappropriate comments, and that when she rejected my advances, I had retaliated by filing a false harassment complaint to get her fired. Mark said that initially, he had believed Rachel's version of events and was actually calling to confront me about my alleged behavior toward his wife. But as he started asking more specific questions about the timeline and details of what supposedly happened, Rachel's story began to fall apart. Mark told me that Rachel's version of events kept changing every time he asked for clarification. She couldn't explain why she hadn't reported my alleged harassment to HR herself, why she hadn't blocked my number if I was sending unwanted messages, or why several of her colleagues had apparently witnessed her inappropriate behavior toward me rather than the other way around. What really made Mark suspicious was when he found Rachel's phone and saw the actual text message thread between us. He could clearly see that she had been the one initiating personal conversations and sending inappropriate messages, while my responses were brief and professional. He also found photos on her phone that she had sent to me, without any request or encouragement. On my part, Mark apologized profusely for his wife's behavior and for initially believing her false accusations against me. He explained that this wasn't the first time Rachel had been inappropriate with men, but it was the first time it had resulted in serious consequences like losing her job. He said that Rachel had a pattern of seeking attention from other men and crossing boundaries, but she had always managed to talk her way out of trouble before. The phone call was awkward but also validating. It confirmed that I had made the right decision in reporting Rachel's behavior and that the company's investigation had reached the correct conclusion. Mark assured me that he would be dealing with Rachel's dishonesty and that I wouldn't have any further problems from either of them. Mark also mentioned that he was considering divorce, as this incident had opened his eyes to patterns of behavior that he had been ignoring or making excuses for. He said that learning about Rachel's lies and manipulation had made him realize that their marriage had deeper problems than he had wanted to acknowledge. In the months since this incident, I've had time to reflect on the entire experience and what I learned from it. First and most importantly, I learned that it's crucial to document inappropriate behavior and report it through proper channels, even when it feels uncomfortable or risky. If I hadn't kept records of Rachel's messages and behavior, the investigation might not have been as clear-cut. I also learned that workplace harassment can happen to anyone, regardless of gender, and that it's important not to ignore red flags or make excuses for inappropriate behavior. Rachel's initial friendly comments and compliments might have seemed harmless, but they were a part of an escalating pattern that eventually became much more serious. The experience also taught me about the importance of clear, direct communication when setting boundaries. While I thought I was being polite by trying to deflect Rachel's advances subtly, my approach may have actually encouraged her to be more persistent. When I finally became direct and explicit about my lack of interest, it was more effective, even though it didn't completely solve the problem from a professional standpoint. This experience reinforced my belief in maintaining clear boundaries between personal and professional relationships. While it's important to be friendly and collaborative with colleagues, there's a big difference between professional courtesy and personal involvement. The aftermath of the situation has been mostly positive. My company followed through on their promise of no retaliation, and I've actually been promoted since then to a senior developer position. My new manager is professional and respectful, and I haven't had any similar issues with other colleagues. I did hear through the office grapevine that Rachel struggled to find new employment after being terminated for sexual harassment. Apparently, our company's HR department provided honest references when potential employers called, which made it difficult for her to land another management position. While I don't take pleasure in anyone's professional difficulties, I do think there need to be consequences for this type of behavior. The situation with Mark and Rachel's marriage was more complicated. From what I understand through mutual acquaintances, Mark did end up filing for divorce about 6 months after our phone conversation. The harassment incident was apparently just one of many issues in their relationship, and learning about Rachel's pattern of dishonesty was the final straw for him. I felt somewhat guilty about the role my complaint played in breaking up their family, especially since they had young children. But I also realized that I wasn't responsible for Rachel's choices or the consequences of her behavior. She made the decision to harass a colleague, lie to her husband about it, and tried to manipulate the situation to avoid responsibility. Looking back on this experience, I'm grateful that I worked for a company with competent HR policies and leadership that took harassment complaints seriously. I know that's not always the case, and many people in similar situations don't have the same level of institutional support that I had. I'm also grateful that Mark was honest and courageous enough to investigate his wife's claims rather than simply accepting her version of events. His willingness to seek out the truth, even when it was painful and embarrassing, prevented Rachel from successfully painting me as the villain in the situation. This experience has made me more aware of workplace dynamics and more confident in advocating for myself when necessary. It's also made me more empathetic to others who might be dealing with similar situations. Regardless of their gender or position in the company hierarchy, if there's one piece of advice I'd give to anyone dealing with workplace harassment, it's this: trust your instincts, document everything, and don't hesitate to use the resources available to you. It might feel awkward or risky to report inappropriate behavior, but the alternative, allowing it to continue and potentially escalate, is usually much worse. The truth has a way of coming out eventually, and people who engage in harassment and deception usually can't keep their stories straight indefinitely. While it was an extremely uncomfortable and stressful experience, I'm glad I stood up for myself and refused to accept Rachel's inappropriate behavior. Sometimes doing the right thing isn't easy, but it's always worth it in the end.